Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Marion Kelly, June 4th, 1919 to November 12th, 2011. Marion Kelly was a figure in Hawaii's history. She was a towering figure, and she had served Hawaii's people and the Department of Ethnic Studies. She was one of the founders of the Ethnic Studies program in 1970 at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. So we are here to celebrate her work, her life, and her contribution to Hawaii's people. The picture that we see is one that Marion Kelly shows Marion Kelly in her element, working in the field in terms of Hawaiian anthropology, Hawaiian archaeology, and she has dedicated her life to the service of the indigenous population, the Kanaka o Iwi, and for the working people of Hawaii. And she is still very much with us through her work, and in terms of our work, that reflects much of what Marion Kelly had stood for. With us in the studio, we have Colleen Kelly. Thank you, Colleen, Marion's daughter. And we have three colleagues from the Department of Ethnic Studies, Ulla Hasager, McGregor, and Noel Kent, all friends and colleagues of Marion Kelly as well. So what I would like to do first is to offer our condolences to the Kelly family from the Ethnic Studies family. And the Kelly family and Ethnic Studies family are indeed one ohana. So for this is just from our department to you, to the Kelly family. Thank you very much. Yeah, mahalo. Okay, so we shall start by asking Colleen, because you knew her more than any of us, right? And you had spent much time with her. And so tell us your impressions about Marion.
Holy smoly. Wonderful mother, very serious, very intent on getting good things to lots of people, including her kids. I feel so lucky to have been a daughter of hers. No kidding. At the same time, very busy, very serious in the work she did. It doesn't matter if it was in the home or at school or at the Bishop Museum. She was a very dedicated person who wouldn't give herself enough time to finish her work. She was just busy from start to finish every single day in a very good way. She always brought people home who were important to her, so we always saw them. We didn't always understand what they did or how they folded into her life, but she brought those friends and colleagues right into the family with her. So her ohana became very big. Yeah. It was nice.
Yeah, and then she had worked in the Bishop Museum for a long time.
Yes.
And then you were saying something about her and John, your dad, in terms of this work in the anti-war movement and so on, and how that might have affected her work.
They were both very outspoken, as you know, and John in particular was more of a outspoken without many worries about how it was going to be taken. He did not hold the same kind of job as Marion did. He was a he was a musician holding the director. He was a director at the music school at Palama Settlement. And at that point in time, in the 50s and 60s, he was beginning to attend the anti-war conferences in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the head of the Palama Settlement didn't like that, and they thought he was too anti-American for them, so he was fired, and we all had to move away from Palama Settlement. As a result, he was pretty upset and outspoken about that, and so he would, he lost a couple of other jobs because of his stance on what was right and wrong in this culture of ours, this American culture, and that was hard for Marion. She had to maintain a presence to be able to keep her job at the Bishop Museum. So there was that going on at home, and it was a difficult thing. And it's difficult to keep your mouth shut when you know there's something that needs to be said. It's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah, so Ulla, I want to ask you about the thesis that Marion Kelly had done in 1956, my goodness. So would you want to say something about it?
Well, Marion did this work in New York, the basic work for this. Her mother was here in Hawaii, and she told me how she would write to her mother and ask her to look for certain things. She was taking an economic anthropology class with Carl Polanyi, really one of the big names in that field. And she started a project in that class that later became her thesis. For that class, Nana would go to the library and look up things and write out longhand and send it to New York, and Marion would gradually put it together, first as just a paper for that class, and later on she continued to work on that topic.
So what was the title of the thesis?
The thesis that Colleen just told me, she was very young when it came out. And we were talking about how do you do a thesis with two little children. It's called Changes in Land Tenure in Hawaii, 1778 to 1850. And Davy and I was just talking about how that was really changing things. Marion's perspective on doing anthropology and going over material like this was probably the first critical study of land history in Hawaii, and as such, very influential.
Yeah, and that basically started her career, which was about land tenure and use change in Hawaii, and her research was to the benefit of the Kanakaʻiwi and the workers, working people in Hawaii. So Davianna, you have been in the program, also the Ethnic Studies program now department, for a long time. So could you tell us more about your impressions and what do you think Marion's contribution to the program and to, you know, the Kanakaʻiwi?
Yes, well, Marion developed a lot of the core courses that we continue to offer, but while we teach it in our own way, she developed the framework and laid the foundation for the department. Most of the core courses that speak to the conditions of Native Hawaiians or Kanakaʻiwi, and which speak to the history of land use and tenure in Hawaii, as well as economic change and the impact on Hawaii's people, and the relationships between Hawaii and the Pacific, and Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians and the Pacific Islanders. So she was very, she pretty much laid the foundation for the department and was the stabilizing force, because she was among the first of the faculty to teach. She started teaching in 1970, and she was with the department until she later retired. So she really was our niho, or our cornerstone in the department. And she served as a wonderful role model for faculty, non-faculty like myself, and then for students as well, as a scholar and an activist, and someone who was dedicated to give back to the community. Ethnic studies started before there was a Hawaiian studies program, and we had our own department. Hawaiian studies was pretty much offering courses through other departments. It wasn't until 1987 that Hawaiian studies became a department of its own. And so it was very important that ethnic studies have these courses, core courses on Hawaiians and Kanaka Iwi. And so it really pioneered the establishment of very serious examination of the history of Kanaka Iwi and the impact of capitalism and the capitalist economy on Native Hawaiian peoples and our culture.
Yeah. In one, in the email I sent informing our faculty about the passing of Marion Kelly, said something like, she was a fighter of the first order who never compromised on matters of principle. And this is, I mean, this is really true. I mean, she was very serious, and she never compromised on matters of principle. And she was the preeminent authority on land tenure and use change in Hawaii, as I mentioned before, okay, that opened a new field in Hawaiian anthropology, and this is, I think, very important. She dedicated her research to support the Kanaka Iwi national struggle for self-determination. Marion was indispensable in establishing ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii, and it spawned the study of Kanaka Iwi issues in the academy, the establishment of ethnic studies. Marion was clear about the relationship, and this is, I think, is critical, between the Kanaka Iwi struggle for self-determination and the struggle for the multi-ethnic community in Hawaii, in our Hawaii. So I think this is an important factor in all of that. So Noel, I know you have been, a friend till the end, and you were visiting Marion at her house also before her passing and so forth. So could you tell us more about your experience with Marion over the years, since you have been with the Department of Ethnic Studies for a long time?
Forever.
Yeah.
It seems like it. I met Marion in the 1960s, mid-1960s, and we were going over the house to work with John, and there were a group of us who were fighting the Vietnam War and interested in making some changes in Hawaii and in the United States. And we were huddling with the Kellys, and one of the things we should say about Marion is the sort of social skills that she had, the sort of graces she had. She was a wonderfully gracious person, and I still remember going over to the house, and this could be dry stuff. We were talking theory, we were talking some really heavy sort of political stuff, and she really graced the sort of discussions we had just by being there, and it made it something very, very special to have her with us, and it was I'll never forget that. And that carried through always. This infectious, wonderful smile this woman had, and her warmth and generosity, we should talk about that as well. As that's part of the reason she was so effective in what she did. She in terms of human relationships and human relations, she was absolutely marvelous.
Yeah. Want to show another picture on the laptop here about Marion Kelly with Ulla in the field. I think if we can show this in the field. So that also shows like she has mentored a lot of people, including Ulla. And Ulla has done her, maybe you want to say something about your research. You came all the way from where?
I came from Denmark. My professor at the University of Copenhagen was a good friend of Marion Kelly's, Jonathan Friedman. So he talked me into doing research in Hawaii. And when I left to go over here and actually do it, he set it up so I could stay with Marion for a while until I found a place to stay. Stayed there for a year, off and on, or more. And Jonathan has never been good at practical things, so I hope he's not watching this. He had given her the wrong day, so when I landed at the airport, there was nobody to pick me up, because Marion was out at Sand Island demonstrating to keep the tide pools for the kids. So a couple of humongous Hawaiians was driving those wiki carts. They took me. They asked me, where you're going, said, oh, the hotel closest to Diamond Head. And after everybody else was off, they said, where are you really going? So, okay, I'm going to Black Point. So they took me on the way out there. And the front room at that time was very dark. There was this bamboo and stuff, beautiful, but dark. So I opened the front door after the neighbor said, just go in, just go in. And from the deep of the front room came this voice, welcome home. That was John. So I was sitting there just for a little while, and then Marion came and she apologized and explained she had been in the airport the day before. And we talked a little bit. Now, it takes a long time to travel from Denmark to Hawaii. And I had not had a shower, no nothing. She said, oh, we gotta go. And then we left to go up to Ethnic Studies for a meeting with at that time called the Pro-Hawaiian Sovereignty Working Group that was meeting at Ethnic Studies, yes. I've been in Hawaii for 3 hours when I went to, and that was how it went. During morning, breakfast, we would be discussing things all through the day. Constantly mentoring.
30 years, that was it?
I know. If you ever received a postcard from Marion, you will see it's a little dissertation as it is. She was also always very, very strict with her scholarly work, and we have spent endless hours checking resources and stuff like that. Yeah. Which is necessary when you're involved in political work.
Colleen, there's like a celebration of Marion's life taking place. Could you?
Yes, her memorial will be on Monday, December 19, at the Church of the Crossroads, starting at 4 in the afternoon and going until who knows when.
Yeah.
The Church of the Crossroads, for those who may not know, is behind the Varsity Theater. It's a great place for community organizing, grassroots gatherings and things like that. And I am certain there will be a lot of people coming to that memorial to share their stories about how Marion touched their lives, what they know, how they worked with her in this issue and that issue over the years. So it'll be a nice history lesson, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And you were mentioning that you have been receiving some correspondence.
Yes, from people who worked with her back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who are now out of the country or in other states, and would like in some way to be part of this tribute. Yeah.
And in fact, Stephen Boggs, who was Professor Emeritus of Anthropology here, who had worked closely with Marion as well, he had sent, he and his wife have sent a very nice tribute to Marion's. So we will share all these things at the memorial.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. Yeah. So Davianna, you were talking about Marion and ethnic studies and so forth. So could you tell us a little bit more about not only Marion's impact on ethnic studies, but also on the movement, the Kanakaʻiwi movement?
Yeah. Well, that was one of her really beautiful qualities, that she always worked with the community, and her research was always put at the service of the community. So I know she did some of the seminal work on ka'u and the different ahupua and ka'u, which was very important when the community was faced with proposals for a spaceport to be built there in some of these very critical habitats for turtles, but also where there were beautiful heiau and shrines and cultivation systems, which she had documented. And so she worked with the Ka'u community in fighting that spaceport, and also later had worked with the community to start to look at, planning for managing the cultural resources, especially at the area of Punalu'u in Ka'u. And then her other real important work was with the Mokuea Fishermen's Association. And they had maintained for a long time, Mokuea Island is in Ke'ehi Lagoon, and they maintained that they were descended from their ancestors who were the Konahiki under King Kalakaua for this island that was part of a network of fish ponds in what's now Ke'ehi Lagoon. And the state said, oh, no, this island was formed like Sand Island out of the dredge that was taken out of Ke'ehi when they made the landing for seaplanes. And then, the Marion and John both were working with the community and clearing up, and they came across this ancient canoe that was there as part of the fish pond, and she had it examined and tested, and sure enough, it was dated to, probably early 1800s or so, way before the time of King Kalakaua, thereby validating their claims. And the state had arson. They burned people's houses to evict them. It was just appalling. They just went and burned the people's houses down. And, John and Marion, took this evidence, and the state had to apologize, and they had to give the people a long-term lease and a water line to connect them to the mainland, and to acknowledge that they had made a very serious, error and really an assault on these fishermen who had these long-term claims. So that was, in my mind, one of the biggest contributions and evidence of how your work can really help to protect a community's lifestyle. But she was there for Halama Valley, and she helped to do the research, of course, on the Haleo Papa when they wanted to destroy it, when H3 was going in. And she, with Barry Nakamura, were instrumental in protecting that heiau from being destroyed. And she did still, I think, the most detailed documentation and ethnography of Makua Valley, and the historical settlements, and then even the transition to the farming communities, multi-ethnic farming communities there, and which lays a foundation for the claims that Hawaiians have today to have Makua Valley return, to stop the abuse of the land from military training, and to return the land to the descendants of the people who had cultivated the land. So in all of these communities, I'm sure that you both can think of other examples, but those are primary in my mind.
The Makua report in the military version. And finally was released.
Marion always said, she got, before there was a Hawaiian sovereignty movement, there was Marion, basically, who had this notion, this very strong notion and belief that the Native Hawaiian people had really been ripped off in a very fundamental way, not only in 1893, but in all the years since. And she made it her vocation to really set that right, in collaboration with various Native Hawaiian groups. And, and I think she had that sense of indigenous people's rights throughout the Pacific, because she really was involved with other indigenous people too. So this was, she was, I remember back in the 60s, she was expressing this real anger about, this personal anger about what had occurred, what had happened, and this had to be rectified, it had to be changed. Yeah.
Colleen, you can perhaps tell us about your mom's adventures in the Pacific. And that's one. And the other thing is perhaps how her research had impacted you in terms of her doing the research, and how that politicized you perhaps in certain ways.
We had no choice.
That's a good one.
Thank goodness, yeah. The earliest well, some of the early recollections as a kid in this particular family was to have gone with her over to Kona and Ka'u and to help Mom sift through sand and dirt and look for, doing her archaeological work over there, looking for fish hooks and any other implements that were examples of Hawaiian people's lifestyle way, way back in the old days. So there we were, not fully understanding the whole story, but having a good experience sifting and picking things out. The next job she had for us was to go to the Bishop Museum and clean off things that were found, artifacts. Dust them off, handle them very carefully, put numbers on them, and put clear fingernail polish on top of the numbers.
Did she pay you per
We
hour?
got paid $1 an hour. Yeah. But you know, it was fascinating work, and even as little kids, we had a very clearly instilled respect for this kind of history. That although it wasn't very much as a kid, it was right in our hands, and what it represented made a big impression on us as kids. You know, that was our first job, really. So she did a lot of trips in the South Pacific, and I can't begin to run down exactly where she was and when. She was not your typical mother, yeah? Thank goodness. So it's hard as a daughter to really run down exactly where she was all the time. She had lots going on, and it's hard to keep track of her. Thank goodness. Yeah? I was thinking while you folks were talking, she was a person who was a natural believer. Not so much a dramatic, angry leader. She was a natural with a lot of respect for people who were affected by things. She didn't always show up on the front page of the news because she didn't get up there and cuss and swear and bang on this table. She had things to say that were very important, and you could tell she was serious. But she was a very natural, what's a good word for her?
Leader. I mean,
Leader with lots of respect for lots of people. Gandhi is someone who comes up in my head, but it's different. I don't want to suggest that.
But you make an important point here that basically Marion had a real feeling for the underdog.
Oh, yes.
That was very important to her.
Oh, yes.
And she wanted to help. She wanted to help right that situation as much as possible. And she had a sort of disrespect for the powerful who abused that power.
Yes.
That was at the core of what drove her politically, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the courage to
Yeah.
make it public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Noel, I want to ask you about, like Marion, regarding not only the Kanaka Iwi, but, you know, the working people of Hawaii. And that is an important part of that for her. And she was open to, like, international developments and international struggles, not only of indigenous populations, but all other people who are being repressed or oppressed. So could you say something about your experiences or your observations of Marion regarding not only her support of the Kanaka Iwi, but of the working people?
Yeah, she started her career working for Jack Hall, I think, in the ILWU as a fairly young woman, and that sort of commitment lasted her entire life. I mean, she was really there, and a lot of the struggles all the struggles we fought, Waholi Wakani, whatever, whenever people were threatened, farmers or working people. She was right there.
Could you
That
could you
was,
say who's Jack Hall for the new generation?
well, Hall was one of the founders of the ILWU in Hawaii, a very powerful union leader who was attacked, rather viciously by everybody from Congress to the local Big Five, and managed to survive and build a fairly powerful and successful union. And I think, I never talked to Marion too much about that experience, but I think it was an important one because it showed her that when people really fight and when there's solidarity and unity, you can win victories, important victories. So that was a real part of the germination of Marion Kelly as a political activist and a person who was playing a real historical role in Hawaii. Yeah.
So you wanted to say something, Colleen?
Oh, it just made me think. I don't know too many details about this, but when she was in school in the 40s, late 40s, in New York, where I was born, she and my father were involved in the caravans, which in those days were supportive of black rights. And they were right in the thick of it.
They were in Peekskill when that,
Yes.
that famous incident occurred where there was this sort of hysterical anti-communism and people were attacked and beaten, and which was partly motivated by anti-black sentiment, and fears of, of integration. So yeah, she played a real role. I mean, all around. I mean, and very courageous. And your father too. I mean, both of them.
Yeah.
They
I know she was like a supporter of the Palestinian struggle for independence, another indigenous struggle, but also beyond that, other struggles, always whether anti-dictatorship, anti-capitalist kind of repressive regimes and so on, like Marcos, for instance, and so on.
Marion Kelly's perspective was far beyond Hawaii. It was Hawaii, and Hawaii was the focus of her work, but it was Pacific-wide and it was global. I mean, she looked at things in global terms.
Yeah,
I think
David.
she was instrumental in making us aware of the dangers of French nuclear testing at Mururoa, and she brought the Danielsons who were documenting the health problems and the impact on the Tahitians. So she raised a lot of consciousness about the whole nuclear threat, during that time of Cold War, but how it was really a hot war here in the Pacific because we were Pacific Islanders were being directly exposed to nuclear testing in Mururoa as well as in Bikini and the Marshalls, and she did a lot of work to educate our community about that.
Yeah.
Right around then, and again, I'm sorry I don't have dates right at the top of my head, when we were living at Palama Settlement, we had the glorious experience of having been visited by the FBI, who declared that they were going to snoop around in our closets and take a look at the books and other documents that we had. Well, Marion had a cage of parakeets that for us kids, yeah? And it was a larger, like a small aviary. And she believed in rights, and so she cleaned out the cage every week and let the birds fly around the front room. They're free, yeah? Here come the FBI guys knocking on the door, all dressed up in suits, and the parakeets are flying around the front room. And you can't ask these guys to leave, something worse might happen. So the parakeets flew over there and pooped right on their head and pooped right on their shoulder. And they had to leave, they weren't very happy. Well,
So much for J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you. You were mentioning that you watched this movie about Edgar Hoover. So those was the Hoover days. So we have, yeah, the Hoover days. I mean, that's really interesting on that. But also one of the courses that she had developed was Hawaii and the Pacific. And that's because of her interest, I mean, that's a clear proof or demonstration of her, interest in the Pacific by developing this course. And she had traveled extensively in the Pacific as a child as well. And in fact, you might want to tell us about her big Pacific Ohana. Marion, we were talking about Kanaka o Iwi rights and so forth. She was not Kanaka o Iwi, right? But, yeah, yeah. So, she's part Polynesian, right? And she has this huge family. So, right? Yeah,
Yes, we
yeah.
have.
So you gotta tell us about that.
Oh, God. We are part Cook Island. She has, let's see. Oh, I don't want to take the time and go into details, but she's got a great grandfather, great grandmother who is full-blooded Cook Island. And consequently, we have Cook Island cousins and aunts and uncles who are both still in the Cooks or in Aotearoa or in Tahiti, and they're all around there. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's a great feeling to be connected with a lot of Pacific Island cultures. And those people aren't as commercialized as we are. So they still live their many pieces of their cultural history today. And so it's wonderful to be able to stay connected with them.
Yeah, and she has a cousin from Aotearoa, part Hawaiian and part Aotearoan, right?
Tanya.
Yeah, Tanya
Tanya
Kai.
Kai.
Yeah. And she had visited here. And in fact, Marion had introduced us to Tanya. So we had good relations with Tanya and also the University of Otago, because they had now is a school of Maori and Indigenous Studies. It used to be called Maori Studies only, but now Maori and Indigenous Studies, yeah. And so we now have, through Ethnic Studies and Otago, we have now a memorandum of understanding where we send students and they send students to UH Mānoa, and we send to Otago. So that's like another connection, like Marion had, done for us. You want to say?
Yes, she, usually we would say she's the first graduate of Center for Pacific Island Studies.
That's right.
Yeah. I think there's some debate as to who came first, but
Yeah,
she's usually the one being mentioned
I
as
think
the
she's
first
the one who
graduate.
finished her
Oh,
thesis.
maybe that's
I
why.
think the other one didn't finish. She really did finish first.
So the other one didn't graduate, or what?
I think never finished the thesis or something like that.
Yeah, and also Center of Pacific Island Studies asked us to let them know as to when the memorial is gonna be, so that they would like to participate in that as well, because as the first graduate of the Center for Pacific Island Studies, but also she had known the people there who did research, and those people have respected her research and her contribution to the academy and also to the community. So that's one thing important. And in fact, what I want to say, like in 1999, in talking about ethnic studies and to recognize Marion's contribution to ethnic studies, we had an issue of social process in Hawaii, which is a journal that comes out from UH Mānoa's Department of Sociology. And we called it the Ethnic Studies Story, Politics and Social Movements in Hawaii, and essays in honor of Marion Kelly. So Noel has one here, Davianna has one, Ulla has one. I have a piece here. And then, so I'd like to show this, and there would be like some copies still, you can still hunt them. It's not exactly out of print. There's still a few going around. So this is something that people should read if they want to know more about the Ethnic Studies Department Hawaii's people, and Marion Kelly and the relationship among the three. Thank you. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's very important. But we also have a number of reports, things that Marion had written, and Davianna, you have mentioned Ka'u, for instance. Another one is Kaneohe, about Kaneohe.
Right.
Yeah.
She documented the structure and the function of the Heia fish pond. Oh, and then, that's right, Kaneohe as a whole. This was documenting the landscape and the resources of Kaneohe as an ahupua'a, which factored importantly in actually, protecting Heia from development. And so that there still is a fish pond there, because there were plans to make a big marina and a big, like what we had at Waikai was going to be at Heia Ahupua'a. But I think her work here helped to document, the estuary and then the wetland there that would have been destroyed if those plans had gone forward.
Yeah, so there are a number of those.
But I think she devoted a lot of years to documenting the claims of Native Hawaiians for sovereignty and the Hawaiian independence as well. I think the Pro-Hawaiian Sovereignty Working Group, and they sponsored with Kapakaukau the Hawaiian Tribunal. I remember she was searching at the United Nations to find out, how the basis for Hawaii to still be reinscribed with the UN Committee on Decolonization, and did research to show that the plebiscite, the statehood plebiscite, was not truly an exercise in self-determination, and so we should never have been taken off the list of the Committee for Decolonization. But she devoted a number of years. Maybe you should, and you worked side by side with her.
That was one of our commonalities. She's part of this publication also.
What is that?
I worked with the International Work Group of Indigenous Affairs I still do, sort of, for many years, and went to meetings in Geneva and stuff. And she never tired of listening to how that worked and who you talked to.
Hawaii returned to nationhood.
Yeah.
That's what it
So
it says.
she was really interested in the political aspects of it. And I remember talking about community interest. She actually, with Nelda Quincell, developed a program that was later called a service learning program, where students should work in the environment and get to know people that were caretakers of the land and learn that way. Brilliant idea, but when it came to implement it, she had decided to go to Washington to look for sources to find out why people in Hawaii didn't know that they didn't have to go for statehood in 1950.
While we're talking, maybe we should show a few more pictures of Marion. They're gonna come on the Elmo. This is probably Big Island. Big Island. And the next picture is on the Big Island as well. She was interviewing this gentleman. Yeah, Josh Pinihaka. Yeah, that's Okay, so that's so she's always been on the field. But anyway, I wanted to just mention that as we are talking about it. But I want to ask about this book, or booklet, So you mentioned that this is because you talked about it, and you mentioned this is one of the more important works, or most important, or what is that?
A lot of these area studies are really important because they preserve information from interviews from people that are not here anymore. And for communities today that are trying to preserve their rights, these are resources that they go to.
And then we have, like, just to show how, she is like always working hard and so forth. She has a lot of works. Like, she was prolific in doing those kinds of reports and so on. So we want to show like some of them dating back from 1969, like this one, from 1969, right? And then there's one, I think 1970 or 71, the next one, yeah. So, yeah, survey, that's like Kukio Ahupua'a, yeah?
That's the one
Yeah,
she was
yeah,
interviewing that
yeah.
gentleman.
Right,
for
yeah.
colloquial.
Yeah, that's exactly that one.
This raises the question: was there more than one Marion Kelly? Because how could so much work come from one person? This is extraordinary.
On a
Did she have that
typewriter.
much energy?
On a typewriter.
Where did she get the energy to do all this? Colleen, your mother?
And that was before cloning was happening.
Before computers, yeah.
Yeah. So there's another one. I just want to show like several of those to show like the impact. I mean, not in terms of like global impact, but the impact in the local, that which defines the global in many ways, you know. And without the local, there's no global, and vice versa. Yeah. So we can take a look at more of those works and so forth. So how did you survive all of that?
I don't know. It's a good foundation for, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that, yeah.
So how did Kathleen, your other sister, relate to all of that?
She and I were about the same.
Yeah.
We had great respect for her. We too wondered how she did it, and yet she just kept on going. There was no, you know, Campbell's tomato soup that kept her going. She was a natural. She was a dedicated devotee of movement and people, and
And she had far-flung interests. We should talk about the fact she was a classical musician. You know, she played with the orchestra here. You know, I mean, talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
she was a violinist in the Honolulu Symphony back in her early 20s or possibly even teens.
In the 30s, in the 30s.
And I don't know too much about it, except that she was a dedicated person then too. She loved her music. She did not carry it around. She went from there into union work. And the only funny thing I can remember about that is when she started her part-time job for Jack Hall, I believe, my father wanted to date her. And he said, "Come on, honey, let's go surf." And she said, "Forget it, I've got work to do. And if you don't understand what unions are about, forget it. Go get your act together and we'll talk." It was a little piece that kept rearing its head during later years. And she had a way of reminding us very respectfully that there's more serious things than play going on. Not that she didn't play at all,
No, she
but
certainly did.
She played.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's something like she was so versatile in, you know, in all of this.
She was a Renaissance woman,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Wasn't she? She was. Your mother was a Renaissance woman.
Yes.
She had, you know, she had incredible array of talents and interests, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she was, I remember like once Marion and I were walking through the quad, you know, passing through there. And then another colleague of mine, a woman, saw us. Later on, she said, "Who is that awesome woman you were with?" You know, she was like, you know, she had presence right there. So I told her, I told her about Marion and all that. What I wanted to say, like, I came to ethnic studies in '76. And I was, you know, I mean, Marion was really a teacher for me. Yeah, I learned quite a bit from her. And at one point, she and I shared an office, together. It was a good thing it was a big office. The reason why, because sometimes there would be like 8, 9 people in the office at the same time doing like indigenous Hawaiian work. So that was an interesting thing. And through that kind of connection, I got to know more people, you know, in the Kanaka movement. Although I had met Kekuni, for instance, Blaisdell before and so on. But you know, I mean, through these kinds of the tribunal came, a lot of the work of the tribunal came from our office. You know, everybody like they're staying till 8, 9. Sometimes they sleep over.
Overnight.
Yeah, I mean, Ulla. That's how I met Ulla. You know. Yeah.
Devoted every week.
And the resource
For
room, they would
years.
meet in the resource room at Ethnic Studies for every Thursday, I believe it was, yeah. And I'm not sure if it's still every Thursday, but I mean, but they didn't, they stopped meeting at the resource room once they went to Kekuni's house, yeah. So, but yeah, Ethnic Studies had been a great resource for these kinds of activities, and not only for the Kanaka o Iwi, but I remember for like Ota camp struggles and so forth. And Marion, yeah, Chinatown, and Marion was supporter of Chinatown, Ota camp, you know, and all this. And Waihole Waikani is a good example because it connects the Kanaka o Iwi struggle and the working class struggle at the same time. Something that sometimes is missed by a number of people, that kind of connection and how important that connection truly is, yeah.
If you don't think that the struggle makes a difference, those farmers are still there in Waihole Wakani. And the French stopped nuclear testing. And there's lots of other impacts in history that a woman like Marion Kelly had. And we should take that to heart.
Yeah.
We can make a difference. We can make change.
Right. And I'm proud of the fact that when in 1980, the nuclear-free Pacific met here, that's when it became, after the meeting here, nuclear-free and independent Pacific. And that was an interesting part. And Marion was part of that. Soli also was part of that, introducing the question of independence and so on. And another interesting part we mentioned, like Marion was not Kanaka o Iwi, but you know, everybody in the Kanaka o Iwi movement of import and really active and has the people's interest at heart is very much in love with, you know, loves Marion, her work, and so forth. So I think that is an important thing. And where did she grow up? I mean, that is an important matter, because from growing up where she did to being what she has been, I want to say, that reflects quite a bit of interest here. And, you know, like people might wonder, a woman coming from that kind of background has done all of this. You want to tell us something about it?
Born in Honolulu, raised in Wailua on the sugar plantation by her grandparents. Her mother, a very young person, went off to sea with her father, and they were fishermen down in the South Pacific for years and years. So Marion was raised by her grandparents on the sugar plantation. And actually, one funny story is the elementary school out there noticed that she was growing tall too fast. She was taller than most of the other kids, so they took her out of the physical education class, being afraid she'd keep on growing tall, and put her in the library. So whenever all the other kids were outside playing kickball, she was in the library. Well, maybe that started everything, huh?
Yeah. Maybe we can show a few more of her works, you know, on the Elmo, if we have those ready. But who was her grandfather? I mean,
he was a pump engineer, and he and her grandmother were wonderful people at staying in touch with grassroots people. We had lots of people in those days who were plantation workers that she grew up with. And I think that was one example of her beginnings with grassroots. they were very gentle souls and took care of her very responsibly and with grassroots a sense.
Although like she was in a privileged position on the plantation, she had connections with the plantation workers, and that really developed her attitude and ethics and morality. Yeah. So the impact of her grandparents, your great grandparents, was
and her mother too. Her mother was not a person who was going to go by the rules.
Mm-hmm.
She went off to sea. She believed in people's rights. She believed in environment issues.
Mm-hmm.
She was not a conformist.
Mm-hmm.
She believed in living as you believe, and that had a lot of influence on Marion and on us too.
On that, I just want to say, like my wife, Liana, was saying, and not to forget, I mean, we were talking that Marion was also an environmentalist of the first order. And I think that is an important thing. People don't think about it that way. Because if you are for Kanaka or Iwi rights, for instance, you know, I mean, we're talking about the, you know, the fish pond and so forth. That's, so that is an important thing. So connecting the environment to the struggle of the Kanaka or Iwi.
She would take us swimming down to the rocks. On our way down, she said, oh, don't step on that. It's ilima. Don't step on it. Oh.
So, so it's very good. So we have a minute. Any more things you want to say, like last few things, Davianna?
You know, it's been nice, you know, talking. I you know, when Hawaiian we say halia aloha, we have this fond remembrance of Marion, and you know, her legacy is our department, and so her legacy will live on in her students as well as in her children and grandchildren, and certainly should be honored by our department and remembered for her contributions.
Right. And in fact, I want to say, I'm sorry, I want to say, like a chapter you and I worked on, we dedicated to, in honor of Marion Kelly, and Davianna had put an ole that you have done for her before also to that. So we dedicated that for the EA project, a book coming out soon, I think next year. And the chapter that Davy and I worked on, we dedicated to Marion Kelly. But you wanted to say the final word.
Oh. Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we are flat out of time now, and so thank you all for coming, and mahalo to our viewers, and see you next year. Aloha.